Howdy. First of all, thanks to Tim for inviting me to speak on this, and hopefully I haven't done too many weird things with the slides. Also want to thank, I couldn't possibly see him in the room, thank Eric Wagner, N4RO, for the time and mental support. We had to literally create a little antenna range in our side yard, and it sort of limited the things that we could do, but if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have these numbers here that are so important. And if you get a chance to look at k2av.com, all these people who have helped on this over the years are listed there in totally readable format. Okay, brief K2AV history. And the reason why I'm going into this is a lot of reason why people have trouble on 160 meters is they either could not afford to buy an entire farm, or they didn't even think of 160 meters when they bought their property, which is kind of what happened to me. You'll be able to see all of this on k2av.com. The history is really pretty simple. I was actually introduced to ham radio in a little city over here east called Columbus, and I had a school buddy who took me home to his house, and his father had a 75A3, a Ranger, and a home-built 10-meter ground plane on the roof. And at that time, that of course was the magical 19th solar maximum, and he was working everything and demonstrating it. And whenever he got done working stuff normally, he decided to do something interesting. He got a piece of coax and put a clip lead on the end of it, and then ran the clip lead first to some bed springs, and then worked the West Coast. And then he hooked it up to a window screen and worked the West Coast. And then he hooked it up to something near the radiator and worked the West Coast. And then he went into the kitchen and he came back with a long square noodle. That must have been home noodle, literally wet, put it on the floor, attached the clip lead to the noodle, and worked the West Coast. So I would know many years later that probably the shield of the coax was doing all the radiating, but it was many years. Anyhow, I was hooked. And so then in 1958 to 86, I went to college, I got married, moved all over the place for jobs, and see what happens if I hit this. Moved all over the place for jobs, and then at some point in time we needed to move down to North Carolina to get closer to relatives. And this should be familiar to some of you, kind of some of the reasons that we moved to a place and we can't move again. And that worked out very well, except for one thing. It didn't work real well on 160 meters. And I rejoined the Potomac Valley Radio Club whenever I was down there, and after that, I got a lot of advice. I had a 80-meter extended end-fed half-wave L up, and the guys at the club said, "Well, just use that on 160 meters. It's a quarter wave. Put down a bunch of radials, or put down some, whatever you can do." And I did that, but then my 100 watts didn't really do very well. I added at some point an AL1200 amplifier, which worked really well on the upper bands, but still on 160, even with the 1500 watts, it was hear no work. Much weaker than other people in the area with the 1.5 kW and a good thick radial field. So why so weak? Well, there were contests and experiments, head scratching, a lot of talking with other hams about what to do, and then we had kind of a light bulb event over at W0UCE's retirement place, and he folded back the 125-foot radials and pulled them all back to the center, and so instead of being 225-foot radials, we had 125 feet total of radials. And all of a sudden, he started being heard. And so I got interested in that and checked with it. The folding clearly reduced the fields at ground. And apparently, the RF in the dirt was the enemy. But his 125 foot was still in the neighbor's trees because his lot wasn't that wide. It was more like about 80 feet. And then several light bulb events, and it came up with, well, why don't we fold that and see if that should work? I was into EasyNet at that time, and I said, you know, that doesn't look too bad in EasyNet. I wonder if it'll work. And so you can see how that works. What this does, it comes down, goes over a 1/16 of a wave, and then goes 2/16 of a wave the other end, and then comes back like that, just that simple. And so this was now a plus and minus 33-foot thing to hang up. And now all of it's inside of Jack's backyard. Did it improve anything? Well, the amazing thing was that when we got these up, we started getting something done. I apologize if some of these are hard to read, but what I've done here is I've gone back and I've picked my absolute best scores around the history of the FCP and different events. Now, in 1998, I had no idea about an FCP, but I was using these, throw a few radials down on the ground, and my best effort, which I was so happy with at the time, was 785, 55, and 43. This is in the CQ160 CW, and I got up to 227K with 26 hours of butt and chair. And that was absolutely my personal best. All-time best conditions. According to some, the conditions for that CQ160 CW are the best ever, and they still maintain that. So I had really good conditions to do that. Now, in 2011, this is after the FCP, this was just right after the FCP had first gone up in my house and all that. And I got on, I was unable to run 1,500 watts at that time. And that's a long story as to how that is. That's on K2AV.com, that story about that. I won't repeat it. But I was running 100 watts, not 1,500 watts. And I worked 9, 27, 58, and 38. And so I had 238K in 24 hours in the chair. And that turned out, when the official rankings were out, to be number 4 USA and number 1 W4. And when I finally figured out how much better that was, I was really, really amazed. And I did write an article for the NCJ, which they put in there. And the thing was, run 1,500 watts to make a score, and then later on you change something and you run 100 watts and make the same score. Something's going on. And the interesting thing about that is if you go and calculate all the numbers and everything there, that's a 12 dB change. 12-ish. Don't know exactly what it is, don't know why or how or anything, and people could argue with it, but the difference was 12 dB-ish. Something's going on. In 2020, by this time, we had pretty much improved the FCP as far as it's going to go, and various little things that you could do wrong with it. And running 1,500 watts this time made 752K, which is that's my all-time best on just about any contest. And that was 25 hours in the chair, and the official rank was number 7 USA, number 1 W4. And if you'd have told me back in 1998 that I could put up a weird folded wire and make those kind of scores, I would have been wondering about your mental state. Let's go back to this, because what I really want to get to is I want to get to how it works, because if we can explain how it works and you can see that and understand it, it'll be a little more believable. So the FCP is 66 feet end to end. Its recommended height is 10 feet, and that's to keep it away from the ground and also keep it from being taken down by deer's antlers and that sort of thing. The 5/16 wave is not resonant. It's not a resonant device at all. In fact, usually on 160, the FCP reactance is about 130 ohms reactive, capacitive, and that's that varies around a lot. It could be down around 80, it could be up around 170, but it's definitely reactive, and you wind up having to make adjustments in your inverted L to take care of it. Now, as to how it works, well, length is one thing. Now, what we were doing when we were taking these measurements is we were starting with a 200-foot dipole, 100 feet, and the reason why it's 200 instead of 250, 125 on either side, is there wasn't room on my property to do that, which was the problem in the first place. So we did it at 100. We did the dipole at 200 feet. We did the dipole at 132 feet. That would be regular 80 meters, and then we did it at 66 feet, which would be 40 meters. And the whole point here is that the length on the ground makes a change. Now, one way to understand this is kind of everybody understands wingspan, right? So wingspan on 20 meters is like a small business jet. But when you get up to 250 feet, guess what the wingspan is? It fits right in between a 747 and an Airbus A380. So the amount of space that it takes for a pair of quarter waves is really kind of big, because you would never look at a 747 and think, you know, that wasn't like a long way from one to the end. So what happens if it turns out that the loss on the ground is proportional to the length of the radials? Well, we did that measurement. We had 200 feet, 132 feet, and 66 feet that we're doing. Now, the 152 in there was another time where we were measuring, trying to figure out why bogs were so different. And we found out that the velocity factor for on 152 feet depended on everything in the world. So you get over to the column where it shows resonance resistance, that's F0R there. When we measured the 200 feet, we got 125 ohms. This is just a regular antenna readout on a rig expert. When we did it for 132 feet, it was only 78 ohms. And when we did it for 66 feet, it was only 28 ohms. So the shorter it got, it was going down. Another interesting thing is if you look at ohms per foot, at 200 feet, it was 0.63. At 132 feet, it was 0.59. And at 66 feet, it was 0.42. Well, those numbers are roughly similar. So that you could actually say that the length of the wire on the ground, you multiply roughly a half an ohm per foot, at least in my backyard with my dirt, and it's a half an ohm per foot on the wire. Now, when I did the when I took the advice of my club members and put down a few radials and stuff like that, when it was all said and done with, I had 5 radials, 125 feet. And you can see that that's an awful lot of loss to have in there. That's 175 ohms, 75 ohms on a side. And so I divided it by 5 by having the, I divided it by 5 by having the 5 in parallel. Now then, the height gets into things too. This is going to be interesting. This is the missing part of the... No, that's okay, we got it. Okay, now we know that having the wire long is a problem because that multiplies. What happens when you raise it up and down? Those numbers were on the ground. We also took the wires, the same wires, and we put them up in the air, but principally we took the 200-foot one because we were going to do field strength with that. So we treated it as, first we measured it as a dipole, and then we had a 160-meter whip, actually a mobile whip that we had air expressed in for the occasion. And at 10 feet, the FCP, and with the FCP with the whip on top of it, we put 2 watts on it, and we were very careful to make sure that we had a tuner in front of it to make sure that we were putting the same power on it every time. And we put 2 watts into it, and then 100 feet away on a FIM, Potomac Instruments FIM 40. And so what we were measuring on the FCP at 10 feet with the whip over the top of it was minus 25.2. We changed from the FCP to a pair of 100-foot radials, tuned it up, got it right, and it was only 28.8, down 3 dBs. And if you go through all the calculations, which I can't do here, you will see that the difference between the two really tracks like the difference between the length, the horizontal length. Then we did it at 6 feet, got down to 32 millivolts, 3 feet, 31, but interesting, 2 inches above ground, and we were technical reasons for that, it was only 12. So the difference between 200-foot radials at 2 inches above ground, and the FCP at 10 feet was 13 decibels. This is measured stuff now we're talking about. This isn't a guess, it isn't easy neck. It's what we did in our little ad hoc antenna range. Now, the other thing that you kind of need to understand is, how do you do that with folds? Well, one of the things about how these wires work is that the lowest current is at the end, right? Because it doesn't have anywhere else to go. And so what that means is that the highest current in this standing wave along this single wire is going to be a quarter wave away. Now, we've numbered the points there. That's the 16th from 0, 1, to 2 and 3, coming back at 4 and back up to 5. The current's being pushed in at 5. And the maximum current, because it's a quarter wave away, is going to be at 4. Now, I don't know if you can see that purple line or not on the monitors. Apologies for that. The numbers, this is an easy neck display of the current. So at 5, where it's being pushed on, that's not actually the maximum current. The maximum current is over there at 4, and then it comes back. Now, notice that the currents there are about the same between 4 and 5 and 4 and 3, and then of course it starts on down and drops on down to nothing at 0. Now, I've left probably some unreadable text on here, so if somebody is looking at the slides after the presentation, I'm going to go through this, and the reason why is to understand why the folds and what it's doing. All right, current's coming in at 5. And the small arrows are simply indicating which direction the current is flowing. And in all the blue arrows, the current is flowing to the left. And all the red arrows, the current is flowing to the right. So you can see it goes from 5 to 4, and it comes over and then goes from 4 to 3, and they are equal and opposite, which means those fields are going to cancel, or almost cancel. They're going to cancel a whole bunch. Now then, what will happen over, when you go past 3, it's going to be starting down, and then it'll reverse again at 2, which is why the blue arrow is underneath it. But notice that the only places where the currents cancel is out at the tip of 2. So if you add up, like if you get up close to the middle and you add up the current moving to the right on 2, and you subtract from that the current moving from 2 to 1, then what you get is a net current as if there was one wire and the current was flowing to the right. Whereas over on the left side, basically the current that is left over is simply going to be what's going from 1 to 0. Now then, note that what is left over is the 2 solid lines. The two solid lines are going from the center out to the end. And what that means is that this thing, the current, the effective current is behaving like 2 1/16th wave radials. And we've already seen with the measurement that this thing is better than a pair of regular radials because of the wingspan. Now, one of the things, this is from the journals thing. This This shows you the power, the lost power, underneath the radials. The big one is 2/4 wave radials, and NEC will tell you, NEC4 will tell you that underneath those radials, they add up to that. And you can see that the power loss at underneath the 1/4 wave radials is very large. If you shorten the radials to an 1/8 wave, then you get the smaller one, you know, the middle-sized one. And if you put up the FCP, you get the little one. Now, there's a reason why one side is a little higher than the other one, and that's normal because this is a folded event instead of a doublet. It's odd. So, but also notice here that in the center, that there's a lot of cancellation. And that's because right near the center, it's coming down to the feed point, and a bunch of stuff is going left, a bunch of stuff is going right, and it cancels out. As soon as you get away from it, that effect starts to drop down. Another big thing that you can see if you look at that is that it pretty much notches out this center area, but it's not proportional to the length of your radials. It's just proportional to the frequency you're operating at. And so the notch on the FCP takes away a lot more of the horizontal percentage than it does with the 1/4 wave, which it just almost doesn't matter with the 1/4 wave radials. So the FCP measured was 13 dBs better than 200-foot radials basically on the ground. That's about like giving yourself an amplifier. Now, the interesting thing about this is that if you put down enough, you're going to divide that resistance by the number of radials. So if you put down 100 radials, it will divide the number and it'll work just fine because its effective resistance, you know, is down there around 1 ohm somewhere. And 1 ohm somewhere is not going to bother you. But what do you do if you can't put down those radials? It gets to the point where you need something to do that's good whenever you put something down. You need to have something good, even if it isn't radials. Now, the things that we did, we learned a lot of things about an FCP. It wasn't just figured out all over at one time. And so a lot of this stuff came the hard way. One of the things we learned is you do not trim the FCP's last fold to tune up the SWR. Because then what you did was you moved where the end of the wire was, and of course that moves all of those nice folding things, and then it doesn't work so good anymore. So we had some false starts there. The other one was build the FCP with number 12 bare solid copper wire. And we don't have the time today or tomorrow to go into all the reasons for that. The other thing was keeping a constant small space between the FCP folds, and we finally settled on 4 inches or 100 millimeters. And then the next thing was you didn't have to have the spacing exactly right all over the place, and so some people, including me, originally put it up. I had spacers like every 18 inches, and that sort of hampered its performance. You really only need, on 160 meters, you need one at the end, one at each end, one in the middle, and 2 of them in between, and that's really enough. So use a minimum number of FCP spacers. The other thing is if the bushes or the weeds or the swamp grass or whatever it is grows up into the FCP, it really starts to get lossy. And so we figured out that actually by doing some measurements that you need to keep a 5-foot radius around the FCP, clear vegetation. And so that means that every year you need to go in and do a little cleanup. And the other thing was avoid nearby miscellaneous conductors. So a fellow put up some 80-meter versions of this, and he literally nailed it to the house. and he had a metal siding, and that didn't work so good. The other, do not mount the FCP to or close to tree trunks or root parallel or close to any sort of long wooden beams. Always elevate the FCP 10 feet above ground if at all possible. And there's a lot more, but this day will not permit. Going past, wondering how hard it was to break free from the traditional thinking. I had a wonderful Elmer in Corbin, Kentucky, W4IQZ. He was the chief engineer at WCTT, AM station, I believe. It was on 640. And so he had a huge, huge tower up there. It was 500 foot. It was a 150-degree tower and 150-degree radio field. Had he told me, I think he told me 200, but that was my understanding of how all that stuff works. And that very nicely took care of their problems, and that was really a very well heard station. But an antenna's aerial conductors are intended to produce maximum possible RF radiation with minimum losses. And then the counterpole, or whatever we're using as a counterpoise or a radio system, the design of that is intended to produce minimum possible RF radiation with minimum losses. Well, RF radiation can be soaked up by the ground. It can be soaked up by being next to a tree or in woody land, and you're not going to have minimum losses. But whenever we go to put something together like that, we're not thinking about that minimum RF radiation with minimum losses. Maybe we're worrying about dB slices in the aerial and ignoring piles of dB in the counterpole. In my case, that's exactly what I was doing, is when we were doing that before we finally came up with the FCP, is I was ignoring 13 dB of loss in the counterpoise. Then the other thing is that if you look at it, we monkey with the design in the air, and what we want to do is to make the feed point easy. Well, feeding an FCP is not easy. You have to come up with an isolation transformer and change links and that sort of thing to get to use it. But the reason why we did that before, you don't have to do anything, you just buy this thing, put it up in the air, and screw the coax to it, and it works right then. But what if that limits your design possibilities? Within some limits, what if with the only time, let's just put up an antenna based on the best design and accept the idea that the feed point is miscellaneous and you're going to have to do some matching. You might get lucky and just hit it and don't have to do anything, but chances are, and this is definitely true with an FCP, that if you put up a quarter wave and then put up an FCP under it, that it's not going to be resonant. You're not going to be able to put that together and just feed a quarter wave of coax to it. Well, other thoughts? Now this is where we get into new ways of looking at antennas. You'll notice that the arrow up there is just the best direction. But you will notice that there are no radials on this thing. There's no FCP, there's no anything. Actually, I'm working on this antenna, and it's a little tricky to figure out what the links are, but we're going to get there. You need positive polarity on the slanted line at about at 50 ohms relative. We'll just use that. And then on the bottom one, you need the opposite polarity at 200 ohms. And that creates a pattern. Well, how do you do that? How do you do that with a piece of coax? There's no way in the world, because when you hook a piece of coax up to something, the impedance that's coming off the coax is the same on the shield as it is on the center conductor. But what if this design, and I'll tell you what I've got so far, is in the main direction, it's about 2 dBi. And part of the 2 dBi is because it doesn't have to worry about ground. Now, in order to get that, well, I don't know how to feed an antenna with one of them at 200 ohms and the other one at 50 ohms acceptance. And so you have to do that with transformers. But what if, when you come up with something like this, you've already made the decision that I'm going to put that up because the wires have that gain. And then the next thing I'm going to do is figure out how in the world to make a network to feed it. Design first, feed last. But we don't do that these days. So you would never get to this antenna. And this also has a good front to back, and it's intended to be mounted to a tower without seriously inducing the tower. And there are a lot of multi situations where that's really helpful. Or the other thing is somebody who has a tower that size, 80 feet or so, 75, 80 feet, you can string that from that tower. And this doesn't require a radial field, and then you can take the antenna itself and run it up a fence line or something like that. And you were not going to be able to do that with quarter waves over radial fields. And the way you have to get there is to think about the design first and how to feed it later. So that's about where I've got to. Thank you very much for your time, and I do understand all of you who are trying to get on the band and you can't do it because of your property, and your property is something that you couldn't ever mess with, and sometimes it's the best property you ever saw and all that sort of thing. So at any rate, that's it for the day. And the other thing, how many of you have worked me on 160 meters? Well, we're going to have to work on that. So actually my real reason for wanting you to get an FCP is so I can work you in the contest. But so that's it. Thank you.